Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me in the back? Isn't that how all these presentations start? Welcome to Urban Planning at the United Nations. We have a really diverse panel today. The outline sort of implied that it was all about UN Habitat, but our panelists are from a variety of different UN-affiliated organizations. UN is doing urban planning in many different sectors, not just UN Habitat, but UN Habitat is taking the lead on sustainable development goals and a variety of other things that are really unique for our time. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our panel really briefly. They will also describe themselves. We have on my right, your left, Ron Bogle with UN UNESCO, another affiliate of ours. I have Andrew Rudd with UN Habitat, Daniel Schenzel with UNFPA, I believe. This is the foundation, I'm sorry.
UN Population
Foundation, and Jens Ertz with UN as well. So with that, and I'm Rick Stevens. I'm the president of ISOCARP, International Society of City and Regional Planners, and the Special Projects Chair for American Planning Association International Division. So with that, we'll start with Jens and move forward. At the end, we'll have their contact information up there as well for you to contact them. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Nick. So my name is Jens Aerts. I'm an urban planner from Belgium. I only started 1 year ago working for the UN, and I would say I want to take you also on a journey to become an urban planner, getting involved in the UN system, and I would like to have 3 objectives. Try to convince urban planners to be much more involved into UN policy, because it's a very big area where there's a lot of policy experts and urban planners are desperately needed. Secondly, of course, because I work for UNICEF, I hope to motivate urban planners to be engaged in this child-friendly urban planning. And then thirdly, I also want to get you inspired by what we're trying to do. Because UNICEF is not an organization that is really known to work in cities. That would be the complete role or also the merits of UN Habitat. I just want to explain a little bit what's happening in the UN, and I think as a first speaker I might be able to do that also, to avoid repetition from others that might follow. So I used to work for cities, 70% like city authorities, 30% real estate, people very local urban planning, let's say. And when I came to the UN, I saw there's a kind of Bible. And there's the Old Testament and New Testament. The Old Testament is the Millennium Development Goals. They run until 2000. I'm sure that the experts beside me will be much more precise on this, but just try to give you a snatch on how I saw it from someone coming from outside. And actually the Millennium Development Goals, they were very much oriented into delivering individual support to the poorest, like eradicate extreme poverty, for example. And there was one goal, and I highlighted it in blue, which actually treated the environment. So one of the 8 goals was about environment. Now, since 2015, you probably know, or you might know, that Sustainable Development Goals has been voted or engaged by the UN community, and in that you see much more goals. The world is getting much more complex. There's also much more goals to deliver on environmental related issues. One goal is very famous, especially, well, let's say it's very famous, I think, towards urban planners. It's called SDG 11, the one to deliver sustainable cities and communities. But actually there's a lot of other goals that has to do with creating an environment to be able to deliver on them. And there the urban planner comes in as very important. Because actually you can't deliver most of these goals if you don't have a very systemic approach, if you don't understand that the urbanization that's happening, we have to plan it to be able to deliver. For example, if you want to work on equity, I think it's crucial that we work within cities to find out where's the inequity. How can we measure it? What are the strategies we have there? Because we can't, the world is urbanizing also. That's very important to know. So that's why also the sustainable development goals are much broader, and the environmental aspects are much more important. This is a chart you've seen before. We just remade it a little bit to make it more clearer. Big challenge is still slum upgrading in most of the world. There's 1 billion slum dwellers now, potentially 3 billion if we don't do anything in 2015. And also 50% of the urban population is minus 18 years old, so are all actually by theory children, and 60% in 2030. And so our focus on international policy has to change from looking to, for example, eradicate extreme poverty, because extreme poverty is getting solved more or less, but actually to the massive growth and the very fast growth of cities. And these cities are not planned. That's the problem. So that's why I want to engage the urban planners to really get engaged in this international agenda. Without urban planners, we won't make it. Of course, we won't make it with a lot of experts, but I think urban planners until now have not really been speaking the language, understanding, because we're not experts in eradicating poverty, but we might be experts in understanding how you have to strengthen a system of urban areas and how you can deliver best on all the sustainable development goals. And the urbanization is going very fast. It's something I also had to learn because I come from a European background, and Europe is actually not growing. But Africa is very hard. Cities are growing very fast, mostly unplanned. And we know what happens if we don't plan cities. Then there's no transportation planning. The land use will be enormous. We will all live in urban sprawl. And so we will consume and use a lot of energy. Now we still have, like, let's say, this map that shows that we, in the developed world, are still the big consumers or the producers of carbon dioxide. But imagine that Africa would do the same. We should just not let it happen. Another thing, and that's specific maybe for UNICEF to now finally, because it's also late, but finally to get interested and really concerned about cities, is the demographic dividend. Demographic dividend, actually, what does it say? At this moment, there are still a lot of kids, but the world is aging. So, for example, if we say that in 2015, for example, there's twice as much children below 15 years than the elderly above 60, you can imagine that there's still a lot of future, because these children will grow up, they will become adults, they will be able to care about the elderly, which I am in 30 years. But actually in 2015, you see that this proportion is changing. There will be one child for everyone who's plus 60. So there's a lot of weight on children in 2050. So it's super important to have the world, which will be much more urban, that it's organized in a way that children that just become 18 will be able to actually run the city and take care of a lot of old people. That's what's called demographic dividend. So it's not just only about we have to have more playgrounds for kids. Yes, we need, but we need to really plan our cities over the world much better so they can run the cities and take care of the ones that are not working anymore. UNICEF is very late actually into acknowledging that urban is very important. The urban threats are very important. Why is that? I think a lot of international development organizations, they come all from the expertise to most of all eradicate extreme poverty, which was in rural areas. So a lot of them, they have a notion that the biggest challenges are in the rural areas. So it takes time for these big ships, because UNICEF is huge, to actually start changing towards the New Testament and to really reorganize itself. And I would also say for UNICEF, what's also not so easy is that they're a human rights organization. So they're not a development organization like the World Bank or UN Habitat, who are working with infrastructural projects. They always come in with the entry point, we have to defend the rights of a child. And that's very difficult to describe, because you can say like a city has to be child-friendly, but what does that mean? For example, a city that is safe, what does that mean? A city that is healthy for children, what does that mean? So we are now in a process of trying to define very clearly what are actually urban planning principles about specific spaces that a city should need to be child-friendly city. Because you see, like, you can imagine that you say to these kids, like, yeah, we want to support your rights, that you can be heard, that we listen to what you want, but you also have to acknowledge, like, how do you answer to that? How do you answer this? And this is also about space. It's about giving them a space where they can be healthy, safe, and be supported. Another thing that also I think is new for international organizations is that there's a lot of new issues about health, for example, health problems that are not related with the individual health. For example, air pollution, it's something you can't solve by giving someone a mask. This is just, it's not going to solve the problem. So you have to really invest in the system strengthening of a city. And this is also a good example, I think, that you see, like, there might be a city where you have a potential access to a school, but you see also that the infrastructure, the whole transportation organization is just not made for children to get to school, to get to the services that in theory are actually exactly the selling point of a city, because they just might not be able to access it. And on top, in a car-oriented city, I don't have to explain this, you know there will be much more traffic accidents, there will be much more traffic pollution. So we have to understand, actually, and that's the starting point, I think, for UNICEF, to not start from the child, the Convention of the Rights of the Child, but really to start from what are the exact threats, the specific urban threats for children. I'll name them in 3 categories. On the service delivery, on the service part, it's very clear that we, as an organization, we still have to understand that a city is not rich versus rural. A city might be, in general, rich or richer. There might be a kind of economy that's supporting, but actually within the city, there's a lot of inequity. Within the city, there are areas where the service delivery, schools, health doesn't exist. Like slums, but also, I mean, like even in New York. But of course, New York, they have the data that you can go into the neighborhood level. In a lot of developing cities, unfortunately, this data is still not there. So that's actually a very big challenge for UN to be able to dig into that district level to really see where are the inequities. Secondly, on the environmental level, as I said, there's a lack of public space, but there's not only a lack of playgrounds, there's just a lack of safe roads to cross, to bike, to walk. There's also a lack of secure tenure. Slums, why would someone build a safe house, for example, if you know, like, the house might not even belong to you? You might be eradicated tomorrow. So you don't invest as a slum dweller in this infrastructure. And for children, it's super important because they can't learn at home, so they don't have any place to stay. And then thirdly, which is still something it's very obvious for us in US and Europe, but accountability also. Having accountable local authorities, still something that's not always there. So you don't have an accountability to address problems in a local problem. So these are like 3 specific threats for children in most of the developing cities. What we want to do is actually set up a program that more specifically works on these child-responsive urban settings, because we feel like we could deliver on two scales on the same moment. We could, first of all, improve the service delivery to children, that they get better schools, that they get better health systems, but also we could deliver on the climate agenda. And of course, it's now very problematic to talk about it, but maybe it might be also clever to focus on looking at climate issues through a child lens and not maybe explicitly use these terms anymore about climate, but then also really implicitly and indirectly work on air pollution, work on compact city planning. Because a child only walks. It doesn't have a car. It doesn't need a car. So talking actually about compact city planning is very easy and very, very strong if you would use the child lens. We made some reports before, like 2 years ago. We made a report that I think is very strong from an advocacy perspective. That's what UNICEF is also known for, like to put things on the agenda, to show that the air pollution is really a problem for everyone and mostly for children. Why? Because children have small lungs, they breathe more. They're very dependent on fresh air, so they have both worse physical development if they don't breathe properly, but they also simply die. There's 600,000 children under 5 who die from diseases caused of exacerbated by the effects of air pollution. That's enormous. So if you put that on the agenda, people start listening, and that's what UNICEF is good in and should do more in the future. Another report we made recently is one on actually the water issue, like too much water, flooding, and too little water, the droughts. And also showing actually that vulnerable people, the most vulnerable, they suffer most. Because people who have the children who live in a rather wealthy family, if there's any issue with floods and severe storm, they can recover, they're resilient. But actually children from poor families, it's just declining. So what we're now doing is actually speeding up, or let's say work more structurally towards working UNICEF in urban areas, which is really new. And we want to focus actually on 5 areas. First of all, we want to deliver, we want to know more about intra-urban inequalities through data collection. That's very important. UNICEF has always been very strong into data collection, household service, the mix. So that's something we really want to work on more. Secondly, actually, not that much enforce or support health services or physical services, because that's something that cities normally know how to do this, but maybe help them to have a better social service provision. Thirdly, focus on specific urban environmental issues. For example, things that are not that much on the agenda and that you can explain very well through the children angle. As I said, air pollution, but also maybe waste. There's so much urban waste, and children are just playing on this waste sites. They're not protected. There's no idea about urban waste management in developing cities. It's super important. They are the ones that are really literally sitting on the street, grabbing with their hands. So their pollution, they're very vulnerable to waste, in urban waste. Fourth, participation. I think that the youth is quite engaged in the UN in general. I think we have to try to engage much more also the teenagers, because they have a lot of time and they also know what they want. They are able to really get engaged in a very complex debate, not only about play areas, but really about how a city could function. So that's also one of the strands we want to work with. And finally, and that's of course for me is also super exciting, I think, and that's where you might also be excited that we should invest into urban planning. We're not going to be an urban planning department. That's always going to be UN Habitat, but I think we could be the strong advocate for child-friendly urban planning everywhere we go. UNICEF is in 192 countries, so we are very spread out, and we've never made any message on the importance of urban planning. If we would do that in a very precise way, I think we can really make a difference. And finally, we also will have a new strategic plan. You know, like every big organization has strategic plans with a cycle of 3 years in our case. And we will have a strategic plan from next year until 2021 in which there's one of the 5 goal areas that's very explicitly naming the importance of environment. So we will work very hard on every child lives in a safe and clean environment. Something that we didn't develop yet too much, but what we want to do is actually develop urban planning principles. and based on that, develop a tool of urban planning, a handbook on child-responsive urban planning. Because I think, honestly, I don't know if anyone in the room has ever followed any course on child-responsive urban planning. I think it's an area that is not really known, and I think we have to try to make this crossing between people who daily work on child's rights, because there's a lot of people and they have very strong capacities, and urban planners to really find each other in the middle and to really develop together urban planning for children. And I think there's also a lot of good inspiration outside. It doesn't have to be always explicitly toward children, because then mostly you end up talking about playgrounds. I think just the way about how some projects are organized, you can imagine that child participation can be very interesting into social housing projects, how the streets are designed, how the relation between buildings and streets are organized. What kind of programs would you mostly want to be integrated in slum areas? It's more probably like services that are for youth. Or seeing like there's a lot of innovation happening, but we, at this moment, we don't connect too much with all these creative urban planners outside in the world. And of course, talking about car low neighborhoods, I mean, that's very obvious that we have to be very strong in our advocacy, how to make that and why to make that, to make children much more healthy, to also give families the opportunity to go safe and in a short distance to work, all that stuff. So just to resume, we're really on the start of a journey. I think I can say it because I'm also hired 1 year ago. I think it's typical that UNICEF is now only coming into that space, and I just try to explain you why. We want to really engage with urban planners. We're doing that now through ISOCARP, the International Society of I just forgot what it stands for. You have to help me. Yeah, we're closing. So we're connecting with ISOCARP to develop these children's rights and urban planning principles, and to work on a handbook for child-responsive city planning, which you hopefully can then roll out in many curriculums in universities with you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. My name is Daniel Schenzel. I come from the UN Population Fund. UNFPA, we're one of those UN organizations that has lost track of the link between its acronym and its name. Before I start, I just want to say we are a panel that comes from the UN. We represent every country on Earth. And I just want to point out, I think, the obvious, that there's a lack of diversity on this panel. And I just want to say, for me and for next time, I at least, and I'm sure my colleagues as well, will consider that in a more, maybe this is a late point to make this comment, but let me just say it now. All right, so what I'd like to talk about, we do not do a ton of urban planning in the UN Population Fund, but what we do is to think about population, and particularly to use the tools of demography and to use the tools of population analysis to think about how populations are changing in the future, and to help governments understand this at various levels and think about how to plan not just for their people of today, but for the people coming tomorrow. And I want to, think about, when we think about an inclusive city, when we think about a city that delivers for all, the dynamic of the difference between thinking about all current people there and people who have yet to arrive, who don't necessarily have, there's no clear way to provide them a voice in the planning processes and in the decision making that happens in a city. And so the tools of demography and the tools of population projection is one way to think about thinking of that in the future, particularly given that we are operating in the midst of a radical transformation in terms of the size and scope and reach of cities in a number of ways. So I'm going to build a bit off what Jens said. You guys have, I'm sure, all seen this. This is the sort of leap in urban population growth over time from 1950 to 2050. And as we know, it's concentrated, the most rapid areas of growth are concentrated in Asia and Africa, where urbanization rates are still relatively low. But we can go quite a bit deeper. I think this is where, you hear a lot of this, but also there's a lot more data. So the first thing to point out is that contrary to what we might imagine, the pace of urbanization at the global scale and even at the regional and income scale is slowing. So we're not necessarily looking at this exponential takeoff in the size of cities. What we're seeing is an issue of scale more than an issue of pace. There are a lot more people in the world than there used to be, and cities are much bigger than they used to be, as I'll show you. But they're not necessarily growing, and urban populations are not necessarily growing at the rate that they were. And this is split by income grouping. So we see the world and then richer and poorer countries. But actually, pretty much the same thing is true even for Africa and Asia at the regional scale, if we were look at country groupings by geography. So an enormous amount of this scale is happening in some of the biggest countries. This makes sense, right? So 50% of the urban population growth in the world between now and 2050 will happen in these 7 countries. Big, huge countries, with some with rapid population growth, so for instance, Nigeria and Democratic Republic of Congo. Others just starting from a very big base of population, India, China, the United States, and growing on that basis. And just to point out, this is something that I think we constantly think about urbanization or urban population growth as this big flood of people from rural to urban areas. But this is a hard actually thing to calculate, so this is a bit of an old source, but this is not actually the case. An enormous amount of urban population growth is people born in cities. So I think UNICEF would probably be the first to point this out. Babies are born in cities every day. So a lot of the planning processes, think about what that means, when we're talking about households that are growing in size, not necessarily the arrival of new households. This is quite a different phenomenon. And to think, for instance, we did some work with a number of planning affiliates in Karachi who were looking at public housing options that would allow the opportunity for families to grow and produce intergenerational housing over time, even if they didn't necessarily begin that way. So again, that's something that I think we don't tend to think about when we think about urban population growth or urbanization. A lot of attention goes to megacities, and actually they deserve a lot of attention. There's an incredible amount of dynamism, the global city phenomenon, huge economic reliance on these areas, enormous social pull. A number of these cities are actually growing very rapidly, particularly the megacities in some of the developing countries. Others are more flat in terms of their growth. New York is for instance, a bit more of a stable, and also Tokyo. And this looks a little bit into the future, although it is very much harder to project urban population growth at the city scale than it is at the national scale. Something to keep in mind, and something that really only the richest cities in some respects are able to do, to imagine what their populations are going to look like 10, 20, 30 years from now. But it's not all about the megacities. So this is the distribution from the past going into the future of population by city class size. So here we're looking at I'm a little bit colorblind, but the bottom one, urban areas with fewer than 300,000, all the way up to 10 million or more. And you can see actually that certainly there's been this significant rise in the megacity, and it's going to likely continue. But still, even now, almost half the people live in cities under 500,000 in size. And this means a lot in terms of how we think about how the popular imagination, certainly, of what urbanization means, but also, planning. What are the resources? What is the capacity of the cities? To what extent are smaller urban metros linked to larger urban metros, linked to rural areas? Recognizing, I think, as we have for some time, that this boundary, this hard boundary that we draw between urban and rural and peri-urban is really more of a porous, continuous process, certainly for some urban regions, for instance, or city regions. Now, just to build again off what my colleague was speaking about, there's quite a different population composition in rural versus urban areas. So this looks at the full continent of Africa, including North Africa, and looks at the age distribution. So what we're looking at is a population pyramid. Each sort of band is a 5-year age group. And this is sort of a classic sort of several decade ago, this is current, but several decade ago kind of age structure of a population growing very rapidly. So a lot of children, not necessarily a lot of older persons yet, although to some extent disproportionately, because what we see actually is this dip in the middle of this sort of curve inward, which is working age adults, young people, and working age populations. And they are very significantly disproportionately likely to be in urban areas. And this, to some extent, is a phenomenon of two factors: the searching for labor opportunities, right? Labor migration. This is the rural to urban phenomenon. And the second is that when people move to cities, they tend to have fewer children. So when we think about planning, there's two things I think to keep in mind for this one. One is, what are the needs of the age structure of the urban population in terms of jobs, in terms of access to housing, in terms of the way they compose themselves in households? And the second is, what is the interdependence between urban and rural areas, when we think that what this actually represents is quite a lot of split households that are connected in a variety of social, physical, and financial ways. And to think about recognizing that there are quite a bit of remittances happening back and forth between these populations, and a lot of mobility as well. People are not fixed in a single location, but are moving back and forth quite frequently. And the last thing I'll end with is some reflection on population distribution in space and what it means in the context of risks, in this case, climate risks. So this is out of Colombia, actually. This is the kind of global grid of the population along with low elevation coastal zone. So here we happen to be looking at Katrina. Or sorry, we're not. This is what happens, unfortunately, when Katrina hits. But this is New Orleans. And looking at the overlay of population concentration in low elevation coastal zones. And here again, this is Bangladesh and Dhaka, and we see again this overwhelming concentration of people in areas of high risk. And in that sense, we think about how to protect ourselves from climate exposure. Let's say, well, we have to move out of climate exposed areas. But the trend really is for people to be moving towards climate threats in some regard, because they're moving towards the areas of greatest economic vitality, which are cities, which are very often located in coastal areas due to port development and all of that. So we really have to change the nature, I think, of how we think about people avoiding climate risk and what the balance in people's current calculus is in terms of where they're seeking out opportunity and where they're seeking out livelihoods. So that's the kind of thing that we try to help governments consider and take into account as population trajectories. Yeah, I think I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Great, thanks, Rick. It's a real pleasure to be here and see you all. I'm actually replacing my boss, a woman who was called away to Nairobi on important business, so I'm sorry she can't be here herself. So, UN Habitat, the UN agency mandated to work with housing and urban development, which is headquartered in Nairobi. How are we treating urban planning? I'd actually like to start with Richard Florida's piece in City Lab last week, which quoted David Lewis, the urban designer in Pittsburgh, who, as I understand it, said in the 1980s that the future project of suburban renewal was going to make our 20th century urban renewal look like a walk in the park? We saw this more or less from Jens earlier. It's true that most US cities are much more low density than in the rest of the world, many designed exclusively for the car, which is going to make mixed use and public transit very difficult. We know that there are clear advantages to compact development. We see here empirical evidence that as cities become more contained on the x-axis, per capita emissions on the y-axis clearly decrease. But implementing suburban renewal is going to be difficult, whether because of NIMBY-like opposition to things like high-speed rail that have to go in someone's backyard, or an increasing skepticism of expertise in general, which seems to be partially fueling populism here and abroad. So we agree with David Lewis, but we're actually looking ahead to the next generation, and as my colleagues Jens and Daniel have shown, that's in the fast-growing cities, primarily of Asia and Africa, to a lesser extent Latin America. And this, by the way, is the latest National Geographic Atlas, which we were honored enough to get to work on with National Geographic. So what we're seeing is that many emerging economies, particularly those with growing middle classes, are copying the US model from the 20th century, which is this single-family private house in developments designed for the car, use-restricted, gated, and they're copying this at a scale we've never seen before. Sorry, my bad. So with this design, with this decline in densities everywhere, which is in some places a good thing, hyperdense slums, for example, that need to be spaced out and given public space, but mostly this is greenfield development in cities where, frankly, planning capacities are so low that most local governments are more than happy to give over the job of developing these places to private developers. And the public good and the long-term view of development is really not within the purview of the private sector. So in Habitat, we really see the urban planning problem in four ways. First, the unbuilt, or the as yet unbuilt, which I've just mentioned, and is on track to nearly double the existing spatial footprint of cities by 2030. And that's an astonishing figure. I suppose in a way we would reformulate David Lewis's comment as the future project of suburban renewal in the developing world is going to make early 20th century suburban renewal in this country look like a walk in the park. So for us, it's better to set the stage now while we can, before the growth takes place. But we have a really diminishing window of opportunity to make this happen. Much of the growth is already underway. Much of it, as I said, copying 20th century mistakes. Second, urban fabric that has been planned and built, but inefficiently so, such as this low-density peri-urban area that probably can't generate the sufficient critical mass to support public transit without some major retrofits. Third, urban fabric that has become obsolete. Often in the States, we think of post-industrial sites and brownfield redevelopment. We see that elsewhere, but we're also seeing a lot of this. Residential tower blocks in very isolated bedroom communities that simply have no more demand. They can't be, there's no affordable commuting vis-a-vis the city center. Some don't even have access to trunk water supply. And that leads to the fourth, unplanned urban fabric, fourth major area for us, such as this informal settlement. Lacks basic services and streets, not to mention legality. It doesn't lack density, though. It's taken the UN, I think, one or two of my colleagues mentioned, it's taken the UN a very long time to get to grips with the urban question, if we can call it that. The priority has always been peace and security, so it wasn't until 1976 in Vancouver we got together and talked about these problems. It was a time of urban crisis, refugees, housing shortages, so the name of the game then really was about slum prevention. 20 years later, Habitat 2 in Istanbul talked a lot more about participatory planning and good governance. Great gains, but they still didn't really get at the drivers of urbanization, and it was still largely very space blind. My colleagues have already mentioned the MDGs, very scant on urban, really touching only on slums. SDGs 2015 were an enormous improvement. Again, Goal 11, a real game changer, because it meant that national governments for the first time were acknowledging urbanization as a potentially positive phenomenon when it's proactively guided. But that was a very tough sell. Goal 11 has two exciting targets, I think, worth mentioning. Sorry, formatting's messed up, but this one on urban planning, which has with it the first global metric on urban land use efficiency. And this one on public space. Again, the first global metric on public space as a proportion of total city space. This all set the stage for last October. The third Habitat Conference took place. A new urban agenda was adopted, providing some of the narrative for these more metrics-based targets. And all of this, well, I'll stop here for a second just to say, all of this is great, but it's very high level. We hope that it brings more attention to the issues, more accountability from governments, more funding, ultimately. But we're also involved at the city level, producing these kinds of guidelines on territorial planning, neighborhood design, capacity building for city leaders. And through our new urban planning lab, which is just a few years old, we have actually started working directly with cities. 20 or more at the moment, mostly smaller, fast-growing cities, through a kind of suite of services that range from analysis to spatial planning to implementation. And here's how we're trying to address the four conditions I outlined earlier. For the unbuilt, we're providing planned city extensions, such as this one in Kigali in Rwanda, which is complemented by a new national urban policy, which we worked with to get passed at the national government level. Also this one in Ghana, this is Ningo Pram Pram. You can see the main thoroughfares along which densification and transit will go. Infill blocks in the center, clearly avoiding many of these riparian corridors, also keeping residential development out of vulnerable flood-prone areas. You see here the visible support from the parliamentarian of that area and community workshop. This was a presentation of the first draft for validation. Secondly, for inefficient built urban fabric, we offer infill and densification work. As shown here, this is our urban planning team working with the national government of Myanmar. Prior to our project there, cities were generally extended on the basis of a rural road section. After our work, we developed new urban street sections, a variety of them that could be appropriate depending on the context, and in part inspired by work that was happening in Western Cape province of South Africa. We developed new national guidelines for urban planning that look at how pre-planned and in some cases partially built blocks can be filled in and densified by subdividing land and by consolidating blocks, providing more connectivity, more housing options, more transit options, etc. For obsolete urban fabric, we offer sorts of brownfield redevelopment. I give one example in Johannesburg, who is using the opportunity of this highly underdeveloped mining belt, which you see horizontally through the center in this light purple, to partially solve some other problems. Here at left, we see a diagram showing the extreme mismatch between locations of jobs, housing, and services. How this belt then seeks to stitch together the fabric of both sides and provide some of what's needed in accordance with what's lacking in certain areas. And a lot of that has to do really with land readjustment, replotting to bring a functional grid that can accommodate urban uses. And lastly, the unplanned. For that, we're offering slum upgrading. This is actually our sort of bread and butter. It has been since '78 when we were founded. Nonetheless important now. One example is this informal neighborhood in peri-urban Port-au-Prince in Haiti. 250,000 Haitians moved here after the 2010 earthquake. And we've been fortunate enough to be able to plan with them to add the first main street through this essentially slum. And along with it, extensions of basic services, because finally they have the right of way to be able to extend these. Before then, it was simply impossible. And this in Gaza. A lot of this had been destroyed due to human causes, but we worked with the city there to regularize the parcels, to bring in a new street system and a new system of public spaces that simply hadn't been there before. And here we are working with part of that community in Gaza. I'll just finish by saying these are some of our longer-term aspirations to scale up this planning lab in cities around the world. One, to work more at the metropolitan scale. Another, to try and integrate better supportive legislation at the national scale and more sound financing at the local scale to supplement the planning we do. More support to local planning labs that have actually grown up in the cities we've been working with. And lastly, working better with the multilateral finance institutions like the banks. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ron Vogel. I'm president of the American Architectural Foundation, and I do not have any visual aid today, so you'll just have to look at me. I'm so sorry to say. The American Architectural Foundation is based in Washington, D.C. We're a nonprofit organization that is working with cities, planners, designers on dealing with the opportunities and challenges, mostly in American cities. When the United Nations came to the United States early in the Bush administration and invited us to rejoin UNESCO, the U.S. did so, and I was a part of the first a group of delegates that was appointed to the UNESCO U.S. delegation. So I've been involved in an advisory role with UNESCO for the U.S. For these several years. In 2006, 7, and 8, I served as a co-chair of the U.S. advisory for World Heritage candidates for the U.S. So I bring that perspective to today's conversation, mostly focused on U.S. and not international, mostly focused on U.S. cities. Just a word about the American Architectural Foundation. I'm just curious, for those in the room, how many are working as a member of a city staff in planning, just a show of hands? And how many are in private practice? And does anybody here work for UNESCO or the UN or World Heritage? Okay, you may take notes because I may be wrong on some of this stuff. Some of our programs, we may have worked with your cities. Perhaps you've heard of the Mayor's Institute on City Design, a program that we bring design writ large that includes architects, urban planners, and others to work with mayors on specific challenges and opportunities in their city. As a result, we've learned a lot by having our ear to the ground in cities. We identify trends and activities that may not have hit the national level yet. And if I may, I would share one program with you simply because it's timely and I think it's relevant. This week, we convene in Pittsburgh with a national summit on design and urban mobility, looking at the impact of the introduction of new transformative technology and mobility in cities, looking at the impact on city policy, city design. Any of us who read the paper know that the conversation about technology, virtual reality, virtual intelligence, and other technologies that are being introduced, there's a rigorous national discussion there, but we feel that there's not an equal, robust conversation around how cities are going to prepare for these new changes. And I mention this because we have a summit in Pittsburgh this week. We have 120 delegates coming in. It is not a seminar or a conference, but a workshop in which we'll be dealing with the development of guidelines for cities going forward with regard to preparing for the introduction of these changes in cities. And foremost in our focus is the issue of equity and equal access to transportation, because we understand that that is a pathway to job opportunity and a pathway out of poverty. So we invite you to look for our report, which will be delivered in early June, be sent to cities, you and mayors and others across the country. And we hope this will be a tool that will be useful for you. So we're also learning from our work with UNESCO and tracking the activities there. As our fellow panelists talked about, UN is beginning to shift more and more its attention to cities. We also see that occurring in the World Heritage Program. I'd like to spend just a moment talking about urbanity and heritage. And by the way, for those of you who are here from out of town, I would advocate a drop by to the Tenement Museum as a great example of how preservation and culture and history come together with the preservation of space and the preservation of being able to tell stories about a city's culture and its heritage. So the United States was one of the state parties that brought World Heritage to life, yet we have underparticipated. There are 1,052 World Heritage sites. We have 20, principally focused on parks, with only 3 sites in the United States that have been designated that are planned and designed. Statue of Liberty, perhaps you've seen at some point, Independence Hall, and Monticello. Great places, not very imaginative. Of the other 13, they're almost all parks: Grand Canyon, Yosemite, Mesa Verde, et cetera. Well, it's no surprise in a way, because the National Park Service is the organization that selects. It's not a criticism, it's just through their lens. But when you begin to move forward in terms of the process of what projects are beginning to be recognized by the United States, you see the profile begins to change. In 2008, by the way, there's a process that the state party nominates candidates to what's called a tentative list, and then that goes forward for World Heritage selection. But by 2008, the civil rights movement sites were nominated to the tentative list, so we begin to see a different profile occurring in 2008. And then in 2017, it's like gangbusters: Brooklyn Bridge, Ellis Island, Central Park, and most notably the early Chicago skyscrapers. So this is now really an authentic urban expression of an authentic American invention. And so to find that 9 skyscrapers in Chicago, all built post-1880, have been nominated and are now on the tentative list. I just want to tell briefly a story about 2 cities that competed. One did well, one didn't do so well. If you know Charleston, Charleston's a wonderful city with both a rich architectural history, but a very rich and important cultural history to the United States as a place that received many slaves, and they are elevating that part of their history. They're interpreting that part of their history, and want to be sure that that story is told in an effective and constructive way. So Chicago applied with its 9 skyscrapers and was selected for the tentative list. They used a very strategic approach. Of course, Charleston did as well. But if we look at the lesson to learn from Charleston, they followed the path that many of us might follow. They started out with broad community inclusion. Lots and lots of opinions came in through the process, through the inclusion process. They ended up with way too many sites on their application, 30 to 35 sites instead of 3 to 5. But they had already gotten community buy-in on that. So they now look at it and say, if we were doing it again, we would first start with experts, with our planners, our urban planners, our architects, our historians, and develop a short list that was highly shaped around the requirements that World Heritage is looking for. The second thing they did was enlist the advice and counsel of international consultants, which would be logical. But really, the United States rules for World Heritage are quite different than rules outside of the United States. And so for them, understanding the rules and regulations of how U.S. sites are selected would have been critical. For example, one of the rules in the U.S. is, from the very beginning, is that you have to have the full permission and cooperation of the owners of the property in order for that property to be considered for the tentative list. So it's unfortunate that the World Heritage process is not an annual thing. It will be several more years before that process comes around again. And when I interviewed the head of the process in Charleston today, she said, we're going to try again in 2026. Okay, that's a long ways off. So the intersection of preservation, heritage, and urban is an important development. And we heard about it on a global level today, but it's an important part of our own maturity as a country in terms of how we view cities. The arguments about cities now becoming the central focus of where humans live is an argument that's well known. But what do we do with the physical shape of our cities, and how do we use cities and the history of those cities and its sites to help us understand ourselves more deeply? I often say that Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta will never get a design award. There were thousands of churches built in the early part of the last century that look a lot like that red brick building. But in that building is preserved the DNA of our culture and our understanding of our shared history, the civil rights movement and the story of Martin Luther King. And the idea that we think about preservation and heritage only because of the design quality and not because of the message that it contains is a shift that we hope will occur in our culture. And in your cities, we need to think more about how do we use space, sites, to help us understand our shared history, our shared culture. And as we think about the future of cities, and we think about the tendency in the United States to tear things down every 40 years, it's time for a new ethic around preservation and a new conversation about why should we care? How do we think about mid-century, 20th century buildings? How does that become a part of the heritage story? So I'm glad today to have an opportunity to bring a slightly different point of view, to add to the hard work that these leaders are doing. But in terms of, as we think about our cities and our cultures and the diversity and inclusion, we have to have diversity and inclusion when we think about the heritage and the communities within our cities. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to speak to you today.
We have time for some questions. If you'd like to come up to the microphone here and ask your question. Also, if you could direct it to someone on the panel, that would be great.
Hi. I would like to ask the question to the UN Habitat. This is working. Well, I think this is not working, so I'll try to talk a little bit low. So I would like to ask how the UN Habitat, I mean, you talk about unbuilt, inefficient, obsolete, and unplanned city, but how is the UN Habitat approaching for that diverse and inclusive city? Because it seems that the focus seems to be on the environment, and I don't really for example, issues such as gentrification that are part of the main debate today. How is UN Habitat approaching those issues in cities?
Go one by one.
Let's get a few.
A few?
Don't you think?
Up to you.
Should we get a few questions?
Pardon?
Do you want to get a few questions?
No, I think go ahead and we'll.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, this works. The question was about how we're dealing with diversity and inclusion in our work in Habitat, given that the focus of my presentation was on the built environment and its connections with sustainability, and that was sort of my remit for this presentation, so there wasn't a lot of scope for me to deal with other cross-cutting issues, but we do have dedicated programs on youth, on children, on gender, and their mainstreaming in urban policies, practices, and management that all deal with these sorts of things. On gentrification policies, we do actually have a colleague in our urban economy and finance branch that's helping local and national governments develop policies to prevent gentrification, which in a lot of places are hugely necessary. We were just on a planning trip to China, which is more and more looking to preserve, actually, bits of its urban landscape in a big shift from the past. And we asked them about the threat of gentrification, and the response was, oh, no, gentrification, we're not doing that here. And I said, well, sorry, that's not really how it works. The fact is that's generally the default unless you have something else in place. So working with cities to, in fact, put these prevention policies in place is extremely important.
And just, I'd like to add briefly to this question about UN. There are two publications that you all may be familiar with. If not, I would suggest you search these from the UN. First is the New Urban Agenda, which is, I believe, relatively unknown in the US, although that is the guiding document for the next decade plus for planning. The other one is something that Andrew mentioned, was the International Guidelines to Urban and Territorial Planning. It's another document recently produced by the UN Habitat just 6 months ago or so. So if you're not familiar with those, please take a look, download those. Yep, sorry. Can you just, why don't you turn it, point it down, and, because they're also recording this. Doesn't work at all? I think it's working.
No.
That's a shame.
Do you want to use this?
Yeah, they're recording these sessions, so.
Okay. Okay. Hi. First of all, my name is Rua. I'm a student at the University of Washington doing a master's in urban planning. So before I did my master's, I worked for 2 years at the UN Refugee Agency in Jordan and worked on transitional shelter and supported with camp planning for Azraq camp, which is for Syrian refugees. And at the time, there was definitely a move towards thinking of, even in UNHCR, more of an urban planning approach to refugee response. And there were a few efforts, which I've kind of noted. So for one example was, there was a policy on alternatives to camps released in 2014 by UNHCR. There was also work being done on by Ennead Architects, which is a private architecture firm in New York, in cooperation with UNHCR, on a master plan toolkit. Like, it was called Rethinking Refugee Communities, and I believe that might still be ongoing. And also, specifically in Jordan, there's a document called the Jordan Response Plan, in which they were thinking about longer-term planning for refugee camps. So kind of a multi-part question, I guess. One is, well, the first question is actually, having been involved with Azraq and also having seen Zaatari, which is the other Syrian refugee camp, even though we often as planners, we want to plan for a lot of things, the pros and cons of both camps, there's a lot to be said about Zaatari camp, which was less planned and was kind of managed later on as being more, people are actually able to, or I guess let's just say it's working better for the refugees living there more than the one that was planned. So not to romanticize refugee camps, but to just wondering if there's been consideration also on learning from how communities form their own systems when it's an informal development process, so for refugee camps. So wondering if, like, for example, in the UNICEF case, if that's something that's being thought about for urban planning principles, how do we learn from cases where actually there's not as much planning? Second part would be whether there's been any discussions with UN Refugee Agency on how they are also moving towards an urban planning approach for refugee response. For example, I don't know if there's thoughts on like preparedness plans, similarly how there are preparedness plans for climate disasters, whether that's something that's being thought about for humanitarian issues. Yeah.
Well, while Andrew and Jens are preparing their answer, there are 22 issue papers that form the basis for the New Urban Agenda, and at least 2 of the issue papers deal directly with this topic. So if you're not familiar with the issue papers, UN Habitat site, Google the 22 issue papers, and they have at least 2 of them focusing on these issues. But Jens and...
Yes, I'm maybe not able to answer that very elaborated question, but we can continue also really after the meeting. But I think your point is interesting in that it's also actually indicating like a problem or a kind of mental shift that the UN has to do, in the sense that until now refugees are seen as people will go back, and who can be hosted in rather a kind of a contextual environment, which is a camp, a refugee camp. Whereas I think reality shows that things are happening differently or more complex, that people are, when they become a refugee, that they also are inspired to try to find a new place, because they know the average refugee camp is 17 years, so it's not like something you stay for 1 or 2 years. It's something that's very, very long term. So people use, unfortunately it happens, but disasters and wars are also fuel actually migration or urbanization. And so we have to also find another way how to approach this notion of trying to settle refugee camps. So a lot of refugees end up in cities. So that's why also, for example, UN Habitat has co-pilot the Global Alliance for Urban Crises to actually understand with a lot of UN agencies, including UNICEF, to see like how we could better actually address the notion of refugees within an urban settings. And for example, to see like whether it's realistic to still have a kind of split between emergency operations towards refugee camps versus the urban development, because everything comes together and it's much more relevant. And I think that's also like how urban planners see the things, like to try to address these two things together. So I hope that's already a part of an answer, and I'm sure Andrew maybe might be able to add something.
I know we should hurry up. We've done a lot of work in Somalia, actually planning camps to become formal extensions of the city. I think that camps, when they are planned, to the extent that they're planned at all, are generally planned to be temporary. And the idea that they could become permanent is very scary to a lot of governments. And so this becomes a political issue. And oftentimes we have to kind of walk a sort of tightrope and say, well, maybe they won't stay, but just in case. Because for us, the essential thing is to make sure that the public space is reserved, so that you have rights of way to be able to extend infrastructure and services. Because once buildings are in place, it's extremely difficult and expensive to retrofit and get them out of the way. So at least that much we try to get in.
Thank you. I'll try to make this quick. Thanks for the self-evaluation on the diversity. That's really nice to hear. Quick question. So my point of reference is Brazil, where they do have the policies to try to focus on property rights and the issues of land speculation, which drives informality in a lot of places. How can municipalities not be at odds with the free market and be able to respect private property, but still implement those penalties really on land speculative activities?
You know what? While I have the mic, let me not get too much into that, but just add a dimension to it, if you will, which is, and I wanted to get back to the first question about inclusion. So the Sustainable Development Goals that we saw has 40 mentions of the word inclusion in it. But I think with regard to cities, a lot of governments are still extraordinarily exclusive. And a recent policy survey suggested that over 80% of the world's developing countries have explicit policies in place to limit or prevent rural to urban migration. And I think that's actually a way that governments attempt to handle speculation and land price issues, is to essentially try to create boundaries around the city, protect the city from people they see as sort of precluding the ability of the city to deliver economic goals to society, the right kind of city, the imagined city that they have in mind. And I think that our experience of that is it doesn't produce less urbanization, it just produces bad urbanization, informal urbanization. People without rights living in cities, multiple tiers of citizenship in cities. So let me just add that to your question, and maybe my colleagues can solve it.
Just two small things from me. Taxing vacant land to incentivize development. One, so something we're experimenting with. And the other would be subsidies for developing higher up in areas that have been specifically designated for example, transit-oriented development.
Oh, lovely. Victoria. This is Victoria Koya, also from APA International Division and representative for WeGo.
Yes. Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for your presentation. So as Rick said, my name is Victoria Okoye. I'm an urban planner, and I've been based in Ghana for the past about 7 years, working on, most recently, informal economy issues. So, Mr. Rudd, I was quite interested in your mention of the master plan for Ningo Pram Pram, which is about an hour from Accra, the capital city. And I wanted to better understand what would you say is sort of the economic driver for this extension development? Because Pram Pram is about an hour from Accra. How is the master plan or this development sort of linked to economic development? What's sort of like going to be the economic base? And generally within, at least for the city of Accra, urban informality in terms of economic informality is about 76% of people are informally employed. So are there ways to rectify the formal/informal employment? And then I also wanted to ask about UN Habitat's approach to participatory slum upgrading. There's a couple of projects within the city of Accra, most notably in Jamestown, which is an economically deprived community, but quite vibrant. And one of the major focuses for the PSUP in Jamestown was focused on road paving. And so I wanted to understand, I mean, of all of the things, how does UN Habitat work with local communities or local government to identify the key priorities within those, within these neighborhood communities? What are the priorities for upgrading? Because at the same time, there may be similar challenges. The priorities in that community may be different. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm going to have to defer some of this to two colleagues of mine, one of whom has designed and is managing the extension in Ningo Pram Pram. I'm actually not involved in this project at all. So I don't know a lot of the ins and outs of it. All I can say is I know that the city itself requested the project, and one of their stated reasons was avoiding the economic losses that were happening in Accra due to traffic congestion and lack of mobility around the city. That's about as far as I can go there, but I will put you in touch with the project manager of this, who can answer more specifically. Similar with PSUP, we have a whole program on, as you know, participatory slum upgrading. I can put you in touch with the woman who runs that, but I will say that in every case, it's the community itself, or in almost every case, it's the community itself that requests that we come in and work with them. We work only in a demand-driven way. And similarly with the visioning and priority formulation process, it would always be done in concert with the residents and participants in the room. So of course, every time it's going to be different based on how that goes.
Thank you all so much. We have Ron Bogle from UNICEF, Andrew Rudd for UN Habitat, Daniel Schenzel from Population Fund, and Jens Ertz from UNICEF, all here. And thank you so much again. Thank you for everything.